Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, April 24th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our headline today, Justice Department targets hundreds of citizens in new push for denaturalization. The Trump administration is assigning denaturalization cases to regular prosecutors, which could lead to a surge of people stripped of U.S. citizenship. By Ernesto Londoño and Hamed Aliaziz. The Justice Department has identified 384 foreign-born Americans whose citizenship it wants to revoke, part of a push to increase the pace of denaturalizations by assigning the cases to prosecutors in dozens of U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. Senior Justice Department officials in Washington told colleagues during a meeting last week that civil litigators in 39 regional offices would soon be assigned to file denaturalization cases against individuals, according to an official familiar with the announcement who was not authorized to describe it on the record. Two people familiar with the plans confirmed the broader effort to ramp up denaturalizations. It was not clear what led the department to target the 384 individuals. Under federal law, the government may ask a court to strip the citizenship of people who obtained it fraudulently, for instance, by entering into a sham marriage or by withholding information about their past that would have made them ineligible. Some who commit crimes may also be denaturalized. The government must present evidence to a federal judge through a civil or criminal proceeding, making the process challenging and time-consuming. Traditionally, experts in the Department's Office of Immigration Litigation have handled denaturalization cases, but the effort to enlist regular prosecutors to pursue these cases could lead to a surge in denaturalizations, which have been rare in recent decades. It also comes just months after Trump administration officials ordered Department of Homeland Security staffers to refer upward of 200 denaturalization cases a month to the DOJ. Matthew Tragesser, a Justice Department spokesman, said that officials were pursuing the highest volume of denaturalization referrals in history from the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Justice is laser-focused on rooting out criminal aliens defrauding the naturalization process, he added. Citizenship fraud is a serious crime. Anyone who has broken the law and obtained citizenship through fraud and deceit will be held accountable, said Abigail Jackson, a White House spokeswoman. The push indicates that the Trump administration aims to make good on its plan to increase the pace of denaturalizations as part of its crackdown on immigration. The move will likely scare many naturalized immigrants as the Trump administration has sought to curtail immigration across the board and spoke disdainfully about migrants from certain countries. The message it sends is that naturalized citizens don't have the same rights and stability as native-born citizens, said Amanda Frost, a law professor at the University of Virginia. The government has used this power in the past to target people it views as political opponents. Between 2017 and late last year, the government sought to strip just over 120 naturalized Americans of their citizenship. Such cases were far less common before President Trump was elected, said Ms. Frost, who has written about the history of denaturalization. Between 1990 and 2017, the government filed 305 denaturalization cases, an average of 11 per year. People who become U.S. citizens are extensively vetted. Applicants must provide biometric data and answer wide-ranging questions about their travel history, run-ins with the law, and ties to the Communist Party. Some qualify through marriage to U.S. citizens after 3 years. Others become eligible after having held green cards for at least 5 years. The final steps of the naturalization process include passing civics and English tests. There have been instances of fraud. In 2017, the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security said in a report that an initiative to digitize fingerprints collected on paper in old immigration cases revealed that more than 800 immigrants obtained American citizenship despite having been previously deported under a different name. In 2024, more than 818,000 immigrants became American citizens, according to federal data. Naturalized citizens enjoy almost all the rights and responsibilities of native-born citizens. A notable exception is that foreign-born citizens may not run for president. As such, the bar for stripping someone of citizenship is high. For civil revocation of naturalization, the burden of proof is clear, convincing, and unequivocal evidence which does not leave the issue in doubt, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service said on its website. During last week's meeting, Francie Hakes, the director of the Executive Office for the United States Attorneys, described the 384 individuals identified for denaturalization, the first wave of cases the government intended to pursue. Ms. Hakes acknowledged that several civil divisions at U.S. attorneys' offices are understaffed and struggle to cope with an avalanche of lawsuits filed by immigrants challenging the legality of their detentions. I hope these cases will not be too much of an additional burden, Ms. Hakes told colleagues, adding that boosting denaturalization cases was a White House initiative. Ms. Jackson, the White House spokeswoman, said, "This isn't a White House initiative, it's federal law." Making denaturalization cases a core part of the work of civil divisions at U.S. attorneys' offices stands to divert resources from the types of cases its litigators have historically prioritized. Those include healthcare fraud, procurement fraud, enforcement of civil rights laws, and asset forfeiture cases. A rise in denaturalizations may also send a chilling message, said Ms. Frost, the law professor, hearkening back to an era in the 20th century during which the government denaturalized political activists it disdained. President Trump said in an interview in January that Americans of Somali descent could be among those targeted in the denaturalization push. During the years when the government pursued denaturalization cases infrequently, it tended to go after people who had committed war crimes overseas before becoming Americans. This kind of mass denaturalization campaign will be based on a distortion of the law and is another transparent effort to destabilize long-established principles of U.S. citizenship, said Lucas Gutentag, a former DOJ official in the Biden administration and a professor at Stanford Law School. Genuine fraud, when it actually occurs, has always been aggressively pursued. In recent months, the Trump administration has filed denaturalization cases against a broad range of immigrants. They include a Marine from Ghana who was court-martialed over a sex crime, an Argentine man accused of having obtained citizenship by falsely claiming to be Cuban, and a Nigerian man convicted of running a tax fraud scheme. U.S. seizes second tanker carrying Iranian oil. Navy destroyers are also shadowing several other vessels that left from an Iranian port before the U.S. imposed blockade began, a U.S. military official said. By Eric Schmidt. U.S. military forces stopped and boarded a second sanctioned tanker carrying oil from Iran in the Indian Ocean, the Pentagon said on Thursday, ramping up pressure on Tehran as the Trump administration seeks to resume negotiations to end the war. A naval boarding team roped down from hovering helicopters and fanned out on the vessel, the MT Majestic X, according to a Pentagon statement that included a 17-second video of the operation. The military said the boarding was part of a global maritime enforcement to disrupt illicit networks and interdict vessels providing material support to Iran wherever they operate. The tanker was carrying crude oil for China, according to data from Marine Traffic, a website that tracks global shipping. The ship has transported millions of barrels of sanctioned Iranian oil since at least 2022, according to the Treasury Department. Earlier this week, Navy SEALs boarded another ship in the Indian Ocean, the MT Tifani, after the Pentagon said it was carrying oil from Iran. Navy destroyers are also shadowing several other Iranian vessels, including the Dorina and Seven, which had left from the Iranian port of Chabahar before the U.S. imposed blockade began on April 13th, a U.S. military official said. The Navy is directing those ships to return to an Iranian port, the official said. With the two ships now at least temporarily in the custody of the U.S. military, a U.S. military official said it was up to the White House to decide what to do with the sanctioned vessels and their cargo. The administration previously seized several tankers carrying illicit oil from Venezuela after a U.S. commando raid there in January that seized Nicolas Maduro, the country's president. International waters cannot be used as a shield by sanctioned actors, the Pentagon said in its statement on Thursday, adding that the department would continue to deny illicit actors and their vessels freedom of maneuver in the maritime domain. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, hinted last week that the U.S. military would likely commence boarding operations like the ones this week. He said that U.S. military commanders elsewhere in the world, and especially in the Indo-Pacific region, would actively pursue any Iranian-flagged vessel or any vessel attempting to provide material support to Iran. The U.S. Navy has turned back at least 31 ships trying to enter or exit Iranian ports since an American blockade outside the contested Strait of Hormuz began about a week ago, U.S. Central Command said late Wednesday. Last Sunday, a Navy destroyer disabled and seized the Tuska, an Iranian cargo ship, after it tried to evade the blockade. It was the first time a vessel was reported to have tried to evade the U.S.-imposed blockade on any ship entering or exiting Iranian ports since it took effect last week. House Republicans clash with Act Blue as investigation intensifies. Hours after Republican lawmakers asked the Democratic fundraising group's chief executive to testify, Act Blue sent a sharp letter dismissing the inquiry as a partisan attack. By Reed J. Epstein and Shane Goldmacher. House Republicans investigating the liberal fundraising organization Act Blue have asked its chief executive to testify next month to explain how the group vets its donors, a significant escalation in public pressure on the Democratic Party's biggest financial engine. Hours after the Republican request on Thursday, Act Blue pushed back in a letter dismissing the inquiry as a partisan attack on a political opponent at a pivotal moment in the electoral cycle. The Republicans' request for testimony in a public hearing and the response from Act Blue represented a significant escalation between the two sides. First, Representative Brian Steele of Wisconsin, the chairman of the House Administration Committee, asked Regina Wallace-Jones, the Act Blue chief executive, in a letter on Thursday to appear at a public hearing on May 19th to answer questions about the organization's fraud prevention efforts. Then Act Blue's lawyer, Vincent Cohen, responded in a letter urging the committees to reconsider their current approach and dismissing questions about how exactly Act Blue had vetted donors from abroad. People who are not United States citizens or permanent residents are prohibited from donating directly to federal candidates or political action committees. In 2025, in response to this partisan investigation, Act Blue also cut off all donations from American citizens abroad, Mr. Cohen wrote. The back and forth follows reporting in the New York Times this month revealing that lawyers for Act Blue had warned the organization that it might have misled Congress in a 2023 letter. That letter was a response to an earlier request by Mr. Steele for information about how Act Blue vetted donations from other countries. In Mr. Steele's request on Thursday for Ms. Wallace-Jones to appear, he alluded to the Times article and some of the internal Act Blue documents it mentioned. He suggested that the organization had not provided all the documents it should have offered in response to a subpoena last year. Mr. Steele wrote that there were outstanding questions about whether and how Act Blue had remedied its approach to fraud prevention. Ms. Wallace-Jones and Act Blue have denied doing anything wrong. The response on Thursday did not directly address whether Ms. Wallace-Jones would testify, but instead urged lawmakers to pursue a more constructive and even-handed path forward. President Trump and congressional Republicans have long pushed to investigate Act Blue in an apparent effort to undermine the Democratic Party's main fundraising vehicle, which powers the party's candidates up and down the ballot. The House Administration Committee began its inquiry into Act Blue in 2023 and was joined last year by the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees in the investigation. ActBlue and other Democrats have denounced the Republican efforts as a political witch hunt and have noted that Republicans have not made similar inquiries into WinRed, the primary payment processor for GOP candidates. House Republicans' request on Thursday for Ms. Wallace-Jones follows a demand they made last week that ActBlue produce a host of documents. In that letter, the chairman of the three committees suggested that the organization had obstructed their investigation, including through misleading statements and noncompliance with our subpoenas. The letter gave ActBlue until April 28th to produce the documents. The Times article this month detailed how, in February 2025, ActBlue was warned by the law firm Covington and Burling that a 2023 letter signed by Ms. Wallace-Jones and sent to Mr. Steele's committee had created a substantial risk for ActBlue. Parts of the letter that described ActBlue's vetting process for foreign donations were not necessarily correct, Covington wrote. Covington did not identify any specific illegal contributions, and it suggested that the scope of any potential problems was unclear. Kimberly Peeler-Allen, the chairwoman of the ActBlue Board of Directors, said in an interview for the earlier Times article that less than 1% of contributions from the 2024 election cycle had signs that they were from foreign countries. The Covington memos prompted a string of resignations from ActBlue, including members of its legal and compliance departments. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Why diesel has become a much bigger economic problem than gasoline. The war in Iran has disrupted supplies of diesel, used to power trucks and heavy equipment, much more than gasoline, which is primarily used in passenger cars. By Emmett Lindner. The price of diesel has risen much more quickly than gasoline as the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran has choked global oil supplies. That could have severe consequences for the diesel-dependent transportation industry. Since the war began on February 28th, the average price of a gallon of diesel has gone up about 45%, while a gallon of regular gasoline has risen about 35%. The Energy Information Administration, a federal research agency, expects average diesel prices to peak at more than $5.80 a gallon this month. Gasoline, the agency said, would average $4.30 a gallon. Prices have gone down modestly in the past week on hopes for a peace deal, but the gap between diesel and gasoline remains yawning. Even before the war, supplies of diesel were tight. That meant the world had little buffer when Persian Gulf countries, which produce a fair amount of diesel, were forced to slash exports. Adding to the challenge is that a lot of the oil produced in the region is especially suited for making diesel and the fuel that jets use. This is why diesel more than doubles, while gasoline basically moves up in tandem with crude, said Joe DeLaura, a global energy strategist at Rabobank. You have a shortage of diesel, you have a shortage of jet fuel, you have a shortage of fuel oil. Gasoline is relatively well supplied. Before the war, refineries in the Persian Gulf exported much more diesel and jet fuel than gasoline, and no other countries have the capacity to make up for that loss. You've lost that supply in a market that was already tight, and there's no way to replace that, said Jason Gableman, an energy analyst at the investment bank TD Cowen. China, which has refineries that could have picked up some of the slack, decided to restrict fuel exports when the war started to make sure it did not experience shortages, Mr. Gableman said. The United States is a net exporter of petroleum products, including diesel, and countries like Australia, which used to import diesel from Asia or Europe, have ramped up imports of the fuel from the United States. But with a fifth of the world's oil supply cut off, even the United States could not make up for the missing Persian Gulf diesel. The U.S. can produce quite a bit, but we can't fuel the world, Mr. DeLaura said. In addition, much of the oil produced in Gulf countries is especially suited for making diesel. The oil produced in Texas and New Mexico, by comparison, is better suited for making gasoline. There is another problem. Truckers, farmers, and other users of diesel may not be able to cut back easily, whereas individuals buying gasoline can, for example, carpool or forego some trips. Both fuels are made from crude oil at giant industrial plants known as refineries, but they have different qualities that make them suited for specific uses. Gasoline, referred to as petrol in much of the world, is mainly used in passenger cars. It has less energy per gallon or liter than diesel, which typically powers trucks, tractors, and other heavy equipment. Refineries are only so flexible and cannot make much more diesel even if they wanted to. Refiners are able to use heat and chemical processes to crack molecules and turn them into gasoline, diesel, or other fuels. But once they have decided how much of each fuel they intend to make, they are stuck with those choices unless they spend a lot of money to rejigger their equipment and processes. Generally, the refinery has chosen investments over time to allow it to produce more or less of certain products within reason, said Patrick DeHaan, an analyst at GasBuddy. But you can't bend science enough to just get all diesel out of a refinery. In the United States, diesel generally costs more than gasoline. Before stricter environmental regulations, diesel had a high sulfur content, which caused more air pollution. Now, diesel used in the United States and many other countries must be stripped of much of its sulfur. That process is intensive and expensive. When the low-sulfur fuel was introduced in 2006 during the George W. Bush administration, the price was expected to go up 3 to 5 cents per gallon. The fuel is also taxed more. The federal tax on diesel is 24.4 cents a gallon, or 6 cents more than gasoline. Many U.S. refineries were set up to produce certain amounts of diesel, much of which is exported. As a result, U.S. diesel prices tend to more closely reflect the global supply and demand for the fuel than the price of gasoline. The more that leaves this country, the more that diesel prices are impacted, Mr. DeHaan said. Kenneth Gillingham, a professor of energy economics at Yale, said it was also harder to transport diesel because of a lack of pipeline capacity. As a result, prices for the fuel can vary a lot from place to place. The difference between gasoline and diesel comes about due to the more regional supply constraints, Professor Gillingham said. If the Strait of Hormuz reopens to ships, energy prices will fall and shortages will be resolved over time. But diesel prices may not quickly return to pre-war levels because the supply has been disrupted so much. Getting enough of the fuel to every place that needs it could take months. It's diesel that really runs the economy, Mr. DeLauro said, and kind of runs the world. A huge sewage spill is over, but contamination lingers in the Potomac. Though river monitoring shows bacteria levels have declined, scientists and environmentalists said a full recovery isn't yet assured. By Scott Dance. As public health officials declared the end of a sewage contamination emergency in the Potomac River last month, scientists feared the waterway was still in distress. More than 240 million gallons of human waste had poured into the river from a broken sewer main. Researchers went out in early March to sample the water, trying to see what damage had been done. The color is not good, said Judy O'Neill, an associate research professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, as she looked into churning brown water from the deck of the research vessel Rachel Carson. Weeks later, the lab results confirmed Dr. O'Neill's unease. Telltale signs of raw human waste lingered near the site of the January sewer collapse along the riverbank in Montgomery County, Maryland, some 10 miles upstream of that initial collection site. Dilution made downstream waters relatively safer, allowing for health advisories to be lifted, but the data showed plenty of hazards for the river and the plants, animals, and people exposed to it. And as temperatures warm, the largest release of human waste into the river since wastewater treatment began nearly a century ago threatens to throw the ecosystem severely off balance, experts said. Sewage may be lurking in the river bottom trenches and muddy banks around popular recreation spots that will soon draw people, said Dean Najaux, the Potomac River keeper. Everybody's ready to declare victory, Mr. Najak said. Efforts to determine the extent of possible contamination in soils and sediment are ongoing. Toxic algae blooms, fish kills, and dead zones devoid of dissolved oxygen are unlikely to arrive until the heat of summer sets in, he said. Officials from both the Environmental Protection Agency and Maryland Department of the Environment this week sued over the contamination, filing separate actions seeking to hold DC Water, the utility that owns and operates the sewer line known as the Potomac Interceptor, responsible for its impacts and cleanup. The environmental group American Rivers also declared the Potomac the country's most endangered waterway this month. Ongoing monitoring of water quality data shows strong evidence that the river has now returned to typical conditions, Sherry Lewis, a DC Water spokeswoman, said in an email. The utility acknowledged that rainfall and other environmental factors could cause residual contamination to spike, though. In response to lawsuits, DC Water defended its actions to contain most of the sewage overflow within 5 days, and all of it within 3 weeks. Some of the alarming results the scientists found in early March may have been linked to rain that fell a day earlier, or to a related leak that the Potomac Riverkeeper Group uncovered a few days later. When DC Water used a bypass system to carry waste around the broken sewer, contaminated water seeped into the Potomac River through cracks in an old culvert, the group found. It takes weeks or months for the river to flush most of the contamination, experts said. The Potomac is tidal downstream of a rocky area called Little Falls, near the land border between Washington and Maryland, which means much of the sewage sloshed slowly down the river from late winter into spring. All along, the nitrogen and phosphorus contained in sewage, which feeds bacteria and fuel algae blooms that disrupt aquatic ecology, were being drawn into the food web of phytoplankton, zooplankton, fish, crabs, and oysters. Had the sewer collapse occurred during warmer months, impacts on those creatures likely would have been more immediate, scientists said. But because aquatic life was still largely dormant in winter when the sewage pollution was most concentrated, it will take longer to learn the full toll of the contamination. There are some ominous signs. Researchers found that levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon are far above average for this time of year, said Laura Harris, a professor at the Maryland Environmental Science Center. And farther downriver near Indian Head, Maryland, Dr. Harris said they found a large bloom of phytoplankton, organisms at the bottom of the food web that can help fuel dead zones. Adam Ortiz, a deputy secretary at the Maryland Environmental Agency, said he isn't overly celebrating data that show bacterial conditions improving. The state's lawsuit said contamination could still be seen on the Potomac's riverbanks this month. We're encouraged, but we're still concerned, Mr. Ortiz said. EPA officials declined to be interviewed, but said they are committed to continuing water quality monitoring through May 1st. The agency has been coordinating some data collection and cleanup since President Trump issued a federal emergency declaration for the Potomac in February. The Environmental Science Center's researchers said they plan to continue tracking river conditions far beyond that. Their first data collection relied on funding that they quickly cobbled together. They are working to secure more money for further testing, but we're struggling to line it up, said Ryan Woodland, an associate professor at the Environmental Science Center, helping to lead the Potomac research. The Potomac empties into the Chesapeake Bay, the country's largest estuary, which has undergone a slow ecological recovery over the past few decades. Both the river and the bay have suffered from persistent pollution from sewage, farm fertilizers, and urban runoff. In the Environmental Science Center's latest Chesapeake report card last year, the Potomac earned a D+. The researchers hope to better understand how the surge of sewage affects the Potomac's health and how it may bounce back. We get these setbacks, but the trajectory is in the right direction, Dr. O'Neill said. We want to maintain that. The repaired Potomac Interceptor is once again carrying sewage from Virginia and Maryland to be treated at the Blue Plains Advanced Wastewater Treatment Plant in southeast Washington, D.C. As aging water and sewage infrastructure takes on more wear and tear, Dr. Woodland of the Research Center is certain they'll need any information that scientists can gather. More of these spills are coming. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Afghans who helped U.S. forces say they're being pushed back to the Taliban. Once promised a move to the United States, Afghan refugees who helped U.S. forces say they face bad or worse options: resettlement to Congo or returning home to live under the Taliban. By Eliane Pelletier. Afghan refugees who once helped U.S. forces and have been stranded for years at a former U.S. military base in Qatar say they are being forced to choose between returning to Taliban-ruled Afghanistan or resettling in a third country that some have never heard of. The New York Times reported this week that the Trump administration has been in talks with the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo to send as many as 1,100 Afghans to the Central African country. Camp officials deny that any decision has been made, even as they have for months pushed Afghans to return to Afghanistan by offering free airfare and a stipend, according to camp residents and screenshots of messages from camp officials seen by the Times. Officials at the facility, Camp As Salia in Qatar, told residents on Wednesday that no deal had been finalized. Please be aware no third country has been confirmed or officially announced for resettlement, read a message sent to a WhatsApp group that officials have used to communicate with residents. The U.S. government continues discussions to identify and secure voluntary resettlement opportunities. For months, the Afghans had lived under a cloud, hearing from camp officials and aid workers that they might be relocated to either an African or Asian country. Now we are stuck between bad and worse options, said Arash Pahlavi, a camp resident. Zabiullah Mujahid, a Taliban government spokesman, said Afghan authorities would welcome the return of camp residents. Now they have realized how much importance the Americans give them and how much value they place on those who worked with them, Mr. Mujahid said. He did not respond to questions about reports of human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, imprisonment, and torture against members of the former Afghan administration and allies of U.S. forces. If implemented, the relocation to Congo would be the latest measure taken by the Trump administration to prevent Afghan refugees who helped U.S. forces in Afghanistan from reaching the United States. In November, the Trump administration froze a special visa program for Afghans, and in January said it would close the camp in March. Mr. Pahlavi has family in the United States, but his plans to join them fell apart when President Trump suspended a refugee admission program last year. Since U.S. officials running the camp began offering free plane tickets and stipends late last year, over 200 people have gone back, according to Sean Van Diver, the president of the aid group Afghan Evac, who was briefed on the State Department's plan to relocate camp residents to Congo. 6 residents confirmed that dozens of families have left. Those still at the camp include former interpreters for the U.S. military, Afghan Special Operations Forces, and relatives of American service members, many of whom would be at risk of human rights abuses if repatriated. The U.S. plan adds to a growing list of coercive measures implemented by countries across the world to send Afghan refugees back home. Iran and Pakistan forced nearly 3 million Afghans back home last year. The European Union is in talks with the Taliban government to repatriate undocumented Afghans. A notable exception has been Brazil, which has received hundreds of Afghan refugees since last year. It is unclear whether the deal with the Congolese government would include some or all of the 1,100 residents. More than half of them are women and children. Aid workers and U.S. politicians opposing the plan say relocation to Congo would be anything but secure and voluntary. Congo is in the grip of one of the world's most severe displacement crises and is in conflict with its neighbor, Rwanda. The option to be deported to the Taliban or to move to a catastrophic humanitarian crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo is not a choice, said Representative Sidney Kamlager-Dove, Democrat of California, who is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee that oversees Afghanistan issues. The State Department and the Congolese government did not respond to a request for comment. Residents of As-Salia went through at least one round of preliminary vetting, according to John Feiner, a former Deputy National Security Advisor under the Biden administration. Some have had English and driving lessons and taken courses on American culture, residents say. However, not all had been cleared for U.S. relocation before Mr. Trump suspended the program. Some residents said they would be ready to go back to Afghanistan if Congo were the only other option, or would accept resettlement to Congo. I will choose Congo over Afghanistan because I don't feel safe there in Afghanistan, said Salem, a former Afghan Air Force pilot. But Zara, 15, would be unable to go to school or travel long distances without a male companion under restrictions imposed on women and girls by the Taliban government. She and Salem spoke on condition that only their first names be used to avoid retaliation if they were sent back to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is my homeland. I respect it, Zara said, but I'm not ready to go back. In Lebanon, talks with Israel stir a mix of anger, unease, and faint hope. The Lebanese are deeply divided over whether rare direct talks with Israel are a good thing. By Abdi Latif Dahir. As Lebanon and Israel sit down for a second round of talks on Thursday, the Lebanese people are deeply divided over a delicate question. Is opening a dialogue with a long-standing enemy a necessary step to prevent more bloodshed or a betrayal of national values? Last week, the State Department hosted a round of ambassador-level talks in Washington, which led to a ceasefire that suspended fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Lebanese militant group. Hezbollah is Iran's most powerful proxy in the Middle East, and ending the conflict in Lebanon could help clear a hurdle in negotiations between the United States and Iran. Talking with Israel is a very divisive step in Lebanon, said Camille El-Khoury, 39, a general manager of an e-commerce company and a Christian who favors the talks. These are the first direct talks in decades between Lebanon and Israel, and they come after 2 Israeli-Hezbollah wars in the past 3 years. The latest conflict began in early March when Hezbollah attacked Israel in solidarity with Iran as it came under a U.S.-Israeli assault. The war has killed more than 2,000 people in Lebanon, while Israel has seized towns in southern Lebanon and carried out widespread demolitions. Israel says its actions are aimed at securing communities in northern Israel. Israeli authorities say 15 soldiers and 2 civilians had been killed by Hezbollah since early March. The 10-day ceasefire in Lebanon took effect late last week and has largely held, but exchanges of fire this week along the border have put it under strain. The killing on Wednesday of a Lebanese newspaper reporter, Amal Khalil, and the wounding of a Lebanese photojournalist, Zainab Faraj, also raised tensions before the new talks. Lebanese news media said they were killed by an Israeli airstrike. Israel said that the episode was under review and that it would provide more details later. Under the truce terms, only Lebanon's national security forces are permitted to carry weapons in the southern region closest to Israel's border. The agreement also said that Israel maintained its right to self-defense, but would not carry out offensive military operations against Lebanese targets. President Joseph Aoun said on Wednesday that Lebanon would push to extend the ceasefire and call for an end to Israeli demolitions in the talks. Lebanon has 3 dominant groups, Shiite and Sunni Muslims and Christians. For many Shiites who make up the bulk of Hezbollah's support base, the negotiations feel like a betrayal. Some have expressed concern that the talks could lead to a normalization of diplomatic relations for the first time since Israel's founding in 1948. Other communities are angry that Hezbollah has pulled them into another war with Israel at Iran's behest. They acknowledge that the government has little leverage in these talks and are worried about the outcome. Lebanon has been dragged into a confrontation that does not serve its direct national interests. Mosba al-Saket, 29, an engineer and a Sunni Muslim from the northern city of Tripoli, said in a phone interview. Mr. al-Saket said his expectations were low for talks, doubting that they would yield meaningful results. He said this was because the government does not have a monopoly on military power or decisions on war. Hezbollah's coordination with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps further amplifies the group's influence on the ground and constrains the Lebanese government in negotiations, he added. Hezbollah has left us in a very bad position, he said. Jean El-Sheikh, an oncologist, said the government must press on several issues, particularly the question of land in southern Lebanon. He said the government should also seek backing from Arab and European allies to strengthen its position in talks. More important, he added, it should engage with those across Lebanon's various sectarian and religious groups, especially moderate and centrist voices open to a way out of the crisis. True peace first requires internal Lebanese reconciliation to end sectarian paralysis, he noted. Lebanon remains deeply scarred by a bitter 15-year civil war that ended in 1990. Mr. El-Sheikh, a Catholic, expressed skepticism about Israel's intentions, saying it targets journalists and medical workers and is demolishing entire towns, using tactics similar to those used in the war in Gaza. His concerns were reinforced, he said, when Israel pummeled Lebanon and killed hundreds in a single day alone on April 8th, including family members of a Syrian migrant he knew. We cannot trust this very extreme Israeli government, he said. The only strength in our position is the unification of our national interests and army. Mr. El-Khoury said the talks had already stirred tensions within his friend group. For years, he and his school friends have debated various issues in a WhatsApp group. This week, several members left for the first time after heated arguments over the talks, he said in a phone interview. Those in favor were accused of being collaborators with Israel, while those opposed were seen as Hezbollah sympathizers, he said. We are really caught in a difficult place, Mr. El-Khoury said, but anything is better than staying in limbo. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Duterte to stand trial for crimes against humanity at ICC. The International Criminal Court found there was enough evidence to try Rodrigo Duterte, the former Philippine president, for killings carried out during his crackdown on drugs. By Amelia Nierenberg. The International Criminal Court ruled on Thursday that the trial of Rodrigo Duterte, the former president of the Philippines, on charges of crimes against humanity could proceed. The case would be a milestone for a country in which there has been little legal reckoning for Mr. Duterte's deadly crackdown against drug dealers and users. Rights groups say that roughly 30,000 people were killed during the crackdown, many of them gunned down by police officers, hitmen or vigilantes, and many of them minors or people who were not involved in the drug trade. Mr. Duterte, 81, was arrested in March of last year in Manila and has been held in The Hague since then. Prosecutors argued at a pretrial hearing in February that there was enough evidence to try him on charges of crimes against humanity, which he denies having committed. The court said on Thursday that the pretrial judges agreed with the prosecutors and confirmed the charges. They concluded that there were substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Duterte is responsible for the crimes against humanity of murder and attempted murder. The court described a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population in the Philippines during Mr. Duterte's presidency, and before then, when he was mayor of Davao City. He was elected to a 6-year term as president in 2016 after promising in violent terms to restore law and order. Filipinos have long debated Mr. Duterte's legacy. To some, he is a hero, remembered for cracking down on problems like drugs, petty crime, and violence. To others, the charges are an important step toward accountability. Only a few people have received prison sentences relating to the killings. The charges against Duterte have been finally confirmed for crimes that he should have been punished for a long time ago, said Leila de Lima, a Filipina lawmaker who has long opposed Mr. Duterte and was detained for 6 years after criticizing his war on drugs. This is still a great day for the fighters against impunity and state-sponsored violence, she said. Today, she added, we celebrate even as we grieve for those we lost to Duterte's madness. Mr. Duterte has said the court did not have the right to order his arrest. He has refused to attend the proceedings, saying that he is old, tired, and frail. Mr. Duterte's lawyer, Nick Kaufman, attacked the prosecution's case in a lengthy statement. He questioned the reliability of witnesses he described as vicious, self-confessed murderers, and he said he planned to show that the evidence carried zero weight. Mr. Duterte publicly encouraged the violence in the Philippines. He promised immunity to police officers who targeted drug suspects, government forces engaged in large-scale nationwide roundups, prisons were overcrowded, and bodies were left lying in the streets of Manila. Mr. Duterte left office in 2022 with high approval ratings, and his arrest in 2025 shocked many Filipinos. Human rights groups welcomed the court's decision, calling it an important moment for those who suffered under Mr. Duterte. Maria Elena Vignoli, Senior International Justice Counsel at Human Rights Watch, said in a statement that sending the case to trial opens the door to long-awaited justice for the families of drug war victims and is an important acknowledgement of their suffering. Trump administration loosens restrictions on medical marijuana. The rule moves FDA-approved marijuana and state-regulated marijuana out of the Schedule I category, which includes drugs like heroin. By Devlin Barrett. The Justice Department announced on Thursday that it had loosened legal restrictions for medical marijuana, which officials said would allow for more research and treatment options. The move does not affect the broader criminal classification of recreational marijuana as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, but the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, said the Drug Enforcement Administration would hold a hearing in June to consider doing so. The new rule moves FDA-approved marijuana and state-regulated marijuana out of the Schedule I category, which includes drugs like heroin that have the strictest restrictions, and into Schedule III, a group of drugs that includes ketamine and carries fewer restrictions. Marijuana advocates have long argued that federal drug laws are too restrictive with cannabis, an argument that has gained traction among federal and state officials. The Biden administration began the regulatory process to loosen restrictions on marijuana, but that effort was hampered by delays inside the DEA. Last December, President Trump signed an executive order instructing the Justice Department to redouble efforts to change the classification of marijuana, removing it from the list of addictive drugs with no medical purpose, like heroin, and placing it instead among less addictive drugs that have medical uses. The Justice Department action comes days after Mr. Trump publicly complained that officials had not enacted his order. At an Oval Office ceremony last weekend with the podcaster Joe Rogan, Mr. Trump told other officials, "Will you get the rescheduling done?" He then turned to Mr. Rogan and said, "Joe, they're slow-walking me on rescheduling." The ceremony was held to honor the signing of another executive order about drugs, one that directed more research into the therapeutic benefits of mind-altering drugs like ecstasy, LSD, and psilocybin. And our last article today, could the next Football Hall of Famer be Teddy Roosevelt? A cabinet secretary made the case for the hero of San Juan Hill to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Here's why. By Victor Mather. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum said last week that Theodore Roosevelt belonged in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. At a panel event previewing the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is set to open this summer in North Dakota, Mr. Burgum said, "Keep your fingers crossed, but I think we're going to see Theodore Roosevelt inducted." A cabinet secretary suggesting that a president who left office 117 years ago should receive a sports-related honor may seem puzzling. We've got answers to your questions. What does Roosevelt have to do with football? Football was a much more violent game in the years after it was invented in the 19th century, with less padding and significantly more injuries, and even deaths. While some people called for the sport to be banned, Roosevelt was an admirer and felt the game could be reformed instead. Professional football was marginal at the time. It was colleges, especially those in the Northeast, that were the epicenter of the early game. In 1905, Roosevelt brought the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton to the White House and urged safety reforms. In its front-page story on the meeting, the New York Times took a slightly snarky tack. Having ended the war in the Far East, grappled with the railroad rate question and made his position clear, prepared for his tour of the South, and settled the attitude of the administration toward Senator Foraker, President Roosevelt today took up another question of vital interest to the American people. He started a campaign to reform football. Nevertheless, the meeting led to rule changes, ranging from the invention of the forward pass to the formation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Without Roosevelt, football historians will tell you, the game might have been banned or simply fizzled out. Who is the Interior Secretary and why is he weighing in? Mr. Burgum leads the Interior Department, which primarily manages public land and handles issues related to Native Americans. But it has a broad remit and is sometimes considered to be the department that covers whatever is not covered by the other federal departments. That has not traditionally included recommendations for the Sports Hall of Fame, but the Secretary waded into the territory anyway during the panel at the National Portrait Gallery. "I think we're going to see Teddy Roosevelt inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame," Mr. Burgum said Thursday. He suggested it could happen on the National Mall when the NFL draft is held there next spring. "I'm manifesting it's going to be announced on the Mall," Mr. Burgum added. Mr. Burgum was the governor of North Dakota from 2016 to 2024 and helped bring the Roosevelt Library to the state. Is this related at all to the current president? President Trump has not commented specifically on Roosevelt joining the Hall of Fame, but he has signed 2 executive orders related to college sports, laying out rules for athletes' eligibility and compensation. The effect of the orders would be to limit some of the freedoms that athletes have gained in recent years, including earning money and changing schools. President Trump is a visionary and iconic president who is saving college sports, just like President Roosevelt saved American football, the Department of the Interior said in a statement. As we approach America's 250th, we are blessed to have President Trump fight so hard for our country's legacy. Who gets into the Pro Football Hall of Fame and how? The Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, elects players, of course, and coaches. There is also a contributor category for which Roosevelt could be eligible. Currently, that category includes owners and commissioners, but no presidents. Anyone can nominate a candidate for election to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the Hall said in a statement. Submitted names are forwarded to the selection committee for consideration. Each election cycle concludes with the announcement of the new class during Super Bowl week. The Hall is just now entering a new election cycle that will culminate in early 2027. Nominations will be whittled down and a contributor committee will vote for one person to be put forward to the main voting body, which consists mostly of news media members. A Hall spokesman said that the institution had a defined process for announcing inductees and that there were no plans for an announcement on the National Mall during the draft, as Secretary Burgum had suggested. Maybe the College Football Hall of Fame would be a better spot for TR. Roosevelt, who was in office from 1901 to 1909, was a lot more focused on college ball than the nascent professional game. For one thing, he had a son at Harvard who had gotten a black eye and bruises from the sport. That son, Ted Roosevelt Jr., perhaps proved his father's belief that football was a platform on which to build great accomplishments later in life. The president's son became a renowned World War II hero as the oldest man on the beach on D-Day. Roosevelt might seem a better candidate for the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta, although it too is primarily composed of players and coaches. The National Football Foundation, which selects the inductees for the College Hall, declined to comment. So he made Mount Rushmore, but I guess Hall of Fame enshrinement has thus far eluded Roosevelt. Not so fast. Roosevelt is a member in good standing at the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. The first Hall of Fame in the United States, founded in 1900, it can be found on the campus of Bronx Community College in New York City. It has fallen on some hard times, electing its last 3 members in 1976 and failing to fund busts of them. But there Roosevelt is, in all weather, alongside Thomas Jefferson, Susan B. Anthony, and Elias Howe, the inventor of the modern sewing machine. It is in Canton, but it may have to do for now. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, April 24th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.